and maybe you would never recover, but you could bloody well be sure that it would take you the rest of the day, that's for sure. And so it's no joke when someone steps outside the confines of the social contract, right? And that's kind of, there's a philosopher named Hobbes, who I suppose in some sense was a centrally conservative philosopher as opposed to Rousseau, who's kind of his exact opposite. Rousseau believed that people were basically good in their natural state, so he believed nature was basically good, and he believed that culture was what corrupted people. Thomas Hobbes believed exactly the opposite. He believed that in the state of nature, let's say, every person was at every other person's throat, and the only thing that prevented continual chaos was the imposition of a collective agreement, that would be the social contract, that essentially governed how people would interact, and that would keep that underlying chaos at bay. And you know, my contention is that Hobbes was correct and Rousseau was correct, and I think that if you add Rousseau and Hobbes together, you get a total picture of the world, and that's really, I think, the picture of the world that I'm trying to relate to you. It's both at once. It's like, well, you can't just attribute human malevolence and unpredictability to society. It's a non-starter. It's like people built society, so all you're doing is pushing the problem back. It's like, where did it come from? Well, the society before, well then the one before that. It's like, well, you got to tangle up the individual in there at some point because people created society. And so you can't just blame human irrationality and malevolence on society. Well, and also it's ungrateful, for God's sake. It's like society obviously also makes you peaceful. Part of the reason you're peaceful right now, all of you, is because, well, you're not that hungry. You're certainly not starving to death. You would be a very, very different person if you were starving right now, you know, or if you were enraged, or if you were panicking, or if you were terrified because your future was radically uncertain. I mean, you're just not any of those people right now. You're satiated, and I mean that technically. You're satisfied. None of your biological systems, except perhaps curiosity, which is a rather pleasant emotion, are activated in the least. And you know, because of that, you all think, well, you're in control of yourself. But don't be thinking that. That's just not right. I mean, if you look at how the brain is structured, for example, the hypothalamus, which is a really important part of the brain, it basically establishes the framework of reference and the actions, the framework of reference within which and the actions you take in order to fulfill basic biological needs. So the hypothalamus makes you thirsty, and the hypothalamus makes you hungry, and it makes you sexually aroused, and it puts you into a state of defensive aggression, and it actually also makes you explore and be curious. All of that's hypothalamic. It's an amazing structure, and it's really small, and it's right at the base of the brain. And you can imagine it as something that has tremendously powerful projections upward throughout the rest of the brain into the emotional systems and the cortical systems and all of that, like tree trunk sized connections, you know, metaphorically speaking. And then the cortex has these little like vine like tendrils going down to regulate the hypothalamus, you know. And if it's, when push comes to shove, man, the hypothalamus, that thing wins. And so, you know, you get people now and then who have a hypothalamic dysfunction, and one of them produces a condition called, I can't remember it, it's not dipsomania, although it's like that, it doesn't matter. It produces uncontrollable thirst. And so what will happen is that people who have this hypothalamic problem will drown themselves by drinking water, which you can do, by the way. And so they just cannot get enough water, and there's no stopping them, right? No more than there would be stopping you if you were suffering from raging thirst. It's like, it's a happy day when the hypothalamus is not telling you what to do. And you know, you live in such a civilized state that most of the time, roughly speaking, you're tranquil and satisfied, and more or less you can imagine yourself as a peaceful, you know, productive, well-meaning entity. But don't be thinking that that's what you'd be if you were put in the right situation, because that's just not right at all. So, you know, lots of times soldiers develop post-traumatic stress disorder because they go out on the battlefield. They're kind of naive, they're young guys, you know, and it actually is worse if they're not that bright, it turns out, because having a lower IQ is one of the things that predisposes you to post-traumatic stress disorder. But anyways, they go out in the battlefield and they see what they're capable of under battlefield conditions. And like, you know, we've been fighting wars for a very long time, millions of years. You know, chimps basically have wars with other chimps, the troops, right? Because the juveniles will patrol the perimeter of their territory, and if they find other chimps from other troops that they outnumber, they will tear them to pieces. Like, and chimps are really, really strong, and so when I say they'll tear them to pieces, I mean that literally. You know, they tear them to pieces. And Jane Goodall discovered that originally in the 1970s. She didn't even report it for a while because she was so shocked. You know, she kind of assumed, like most followers of Rousseau, that the human proclivity for warfare was that was something that was uniquely human. You know, it had something to do with our unique self-consciousness or our intelligence or something like that. She had no idea that it was rooted that deeply. You know, we split from chimps about 6-7 million years ago, something like that. And so we were patrolling territory. We were gang members 7 million years ago. And, you know, that's minimum estimation, because of course that ancestor shaded back maybe 20 million years into entities that were roughly primate-like. And so territoriality and the proclivity to defend territory is so deeply embedded in us. It's like the control center for our whole brain. And so there isn't anything more important to us, I would say, than maintaining the match between what we want to have happen and what other people are doing in response to our actions. Like, that's what we want. And as long as that match is maintained, then our emotional systems, and I would say anxiety is probably primary in that regard, our emotional systems remain inhibited. They're on. They're ready. Like a nuclear reactor rods are on. And the rest of the brain dampens them down. But it's like, you don't want them to take time to start up, man. You want them to be on at a tenth of a second's notice when it's necessary. And so, you know, that's kind of why, well, if you look at a wild animal, it's like, it's alert, you know, it's ready to dart this way or that way, especially a prey animal, instantaneously. And it has reflexes built into it, as you do, that will respond way before you're conscious. So for example, if you happen to be walking down a trail and you detect something snake-like in the periphery, you'll leap away before you even know that you leapt. And that's because it takes a fair bit of time to actually see a snake, by which I mean form a conscious representation of the snake. You know, maybe it takes a quarter of a second or something like that, or even longer. But it doesn't matter, maybe it takes 20th of a second, a tenth of a second. But the thing about the damn snake is it's way faster than that. It's really fast, that thing, and it co-evolved with primates, by the way. And so it can nail you like way faster than you can look at it. So you have your eyes map snake-like objects right onto your reflexes, so that the eyes make you jump. And then they see after that. It's like, yeah, well, now you can see, that's no problem, you know. So, all right. Now, what I would say that what we do is we live in a shared story. And the story is a way of looking at the world, and it's a way of acting in the world at the same time. And that story has to operate within narrow parameters. And this is something that's extraordinarily important to understand. Because, and this is something I think that Piaget figured out, Jean Piaget figured out better than anyone else. I think he really got this right. And by the way, one of the things that Piaget was trying to do, you never hear about how strange these great thinkers are, but Piaget was a very strange guy, and he was a hyper genius. He was offered the curatorship of a bloody museum when he was 10 years old, you know, because he wrote this little paper on mollusks, which apparently was very good. And so they offered him the curatorship of a museum, and his parents wrote back and said, well, you know, no, probably not, because he's actually 10. And so that was Piaget, man. The guy was a genius. And you know, he was actually motivated by the desire to reconcile science and religion. That was actually his entire motivation for what he did. You never hear that, but that's the case. And so Piaget was very interested in how you produce structures that enable you to regulate yourself, because you're like a kind of a colony of strange sub-animals that have to figure out how to get along so that you can sort of be one thing. You kind of learn that, I would say, between the ages of 2 and 4 as you're being socialized. You know how erratic 2-year-olds are. I mean, they're a blast, and it's part because they're erratic. It's like they're unbelievably happy, and then they're unbelievably hungry, and then they're really hot, and then they're really upset and crying, you know, and then they're really scared. It's like, and all of that's just untrammeled, and so it's really fun to be around them, especially when they're happy, because they're so happy that it's just, you know, you don't ever get to be that happy. And so it's nice to be around a 2-year-old because you can kind of feel that again, you know. And one of the horrible things about being a parent is that you spend a tremendous amount of your time making your child less happy. And the reason for that is that positive emotion is very impulsive, you know, and you know, because everybody says, well, you should be happy. It's like, well, no. When you're happy, you're actually quite stupid. And so, because happiness makes you impulsive, happiness says, hey, things are really good right now, get what you can while the getting's good. When you're happy, you're actually quite stupid. Everybody says, well, you should be happy. It's like emotion is very impulsive, you know, and you know, because everybody says, well, you should be happy. Positive emotion is very impulsive. You know, and you know, because everybody says, well, you should be happy. It's like, well, no. When you're happy, you're actually quite stupid. And so, because happiness makes you impulsive, happiness says, hey, things are really good right now, get what you can while the getting's good. And so, like if you're hyper optimistic, manic, we'll say, it's like every stock investment looks like a really good stock investment. It's like you go out and spend all your money because look, there's those wonderful things everywhere and you could do such great things with them, and then, you know, you spend all your money and then you crash and you think, oh God, my life's over, you know, because I just spent all my money on all this useless stuff, and it's all under the grip of impulsive positive emotion, you know. And so when you're telling your kids to be quiet and settle down, it isn't because they're making a lot of noise being in pain. It's because they're running around like wild baboons having a blast and disrupting things like mad, you know. And so you got kids, you got to settle down, you know, like quit having so much fun. And it's kind of awful that you do that, but you do. And that's because the emotions and the motivations have to be brought into like a relationship with one another within the person, so that, you know, one thing I remember with my son, who is he's quite disagreeable by temperament, which is actually a good thing as far as I'm concerned, although it brings its own challenges. And so with my daughter, when she was misbehaving, she was pretty agreeable. And, you know, if she was misbehaving, I could basically just look at her and then she'd quit, you know. But my son, it was like, that was just nothing. You're looking at me? It's like, no, that's just not going to go anywhere, man. And so then I'd like tell him to stop, and that really wasn't having much of an effect either. He'd just sort of maybe laugh or run away or whatever. I mean, he was a tough little rat. And, you know, what I would do with him is he would be doing something and I'd interfere and he'd get upset and, you know, angry. And so then I'd get him to sit on the steps, and I told him, and this is when he was about 2, I said, look, you're going to sit on the steps, that's time out. You're going to sit on the steps until you've got control of yourself and you can come back and play the family game again. I basically said, be a civilized human being and then you're welcome again. And so he'd sit on the steps. It was so interesting to watch because he was just enraged. He'd sit there. Like, have you ever seen a 2-year-old have a temper tantrum? It's really quite the bloody phenomena. If you ever saw an adult do that, you'd call 911 right away. It's like, oh my God. And I've seen adults do that, you know, because people say with borderline personality disorder will have temper tantrums, and it's like, man, you want to be about 30 feet away from that person, that's for sure. It's really, but in kids it's like, well, first of all, they're only this long, so how much trouble can they really cause? But it's like, you know, they're just completely gone. They're like on the floor, their face is red, they're just furious, like way more furious than you ever get if you're even vaguely socialized. They're just outraged, and they're kicking and hitting the ground, and like, it's like a little epileptic fit of anger, you know. They're completely controlled by their rage. And we took care of one kid for a while who, he was actually a pushover, that kid. You could get him to behave by, you know, kind of shaking your finger at him, but his mother thought he was really tough because he had her figured out. And one of the things he would do is have a temper tantrum, and during the temper tantrum he would hold his bloody breath until he turned blue. It's like, try that, like, you know, that's your homework. Go home and have a temper tantrum, and while you're doing it, hold your breath until you actually turn blue. It's like, you won't be able to do it. You don't have the willpower of a 2-year-old, that's for sure. That little varmint, man, he'd just have a fit, then he'd hold his breath, and then he'd turn blue. It was like, wow, that's amazing. And we would just like let him do it, and you know, he'd turn blue and everybody would be gone and he'd come out of it, you know, and it didn't work, so he just quit doing it. I think he did it like twice, and he figured out, oh well, that's a lot of work for very little outcome. And you know, it's not like 2-year-olds are stupid. They're not stupid. They're probably smarter than you, but they're not civilized by any stretch of the imagination. And so anyways, back to my son, I'd put him on the steps and he'd be like, just like enraged and trying to get himself together, you know. And I'd wait a few, I got a strict rule, which was, as soon as you're done, you're welcome again. So it's completely under your control. You get yourself calmed down, you come and talk to me again. If you're calm enough so I like you, then you're welcome back in the family. No grudge, nothing. And so it's harder than you think. Like, people think they like their kids. It's like, don't be thinking that. They're hard to like. They're little monsters, and they're very, very pushy and provocative. And so lots of parents do not like their children, and they do terrible things to them their whole life. So it's no joke, and it's very common. And you know, that was Freud's observation, fundamental observation, that a lot of psychopathology is rooted in the family, and you can be sure of that. You know, and when you hear about some mother who's done something terrible to her child, which happens reasonably frequently, you know perfectly well that she has a very terrible capacity to discipline. The child's just provoked her and provoked her and provoked her and provoked her and provoked her, and it just happens to be a day where her new boyfriend left and she's quite hungover and she got fired, and it's like, that's the wrong day to provoke her. And then she does something that is not good, and you read about it and you think, well, how could that happen? How could anyone do that? Well, that's how they do it. And so, and kids are very provocative, just like little chimps. Chimps will, the adolescents will like throw little pebbles and sticks at the sleeping larger males and bug them. And that teasing, which it is, that teasing turns into full-fledged dominance challenge behavior once the adolescent males get big enough to do it. And so when you're being provoked by a child, which they provoke you all the time, they're trying to figure out, well, just where are you exactly? What happens if I do this? What happens if I do this? You know, and how else are they going to figure it out? Anyways, he'd sit on the steps and he's just enraged and trying to control himself, and I'd watch that, and then, you know, I'd come back after about 2 minutes or whatever, and he'd still be, I'd say, well, you know, have you got yourself under control? Are you ready to get off the steps? He'd go, no, not yet. And then, you know, he'd get himself under control, and then he'd come back, and, you know, he'd be contrite, and then I would like him right away, you know. You got to watch that, you know, because you don't like being dominated by a 2-year-old. No one does. And so if the child hasn't mastered himself and started to act in accordance with the prevailing social norms, you won't like them. Well, you think, oh yeah, I will, because, you know, I'm a good person. It's like, no, you won't, and no, you're not a good person, so don't be thinking about that at all. It's just not true. So when he was contrite, then he'd come, and then, you know, we'd just go on like nothing had happened, because that's what you want to do, right? As soon as you get compliance, especially if the compliance is in the best interest of the child, you want to reward it instantly, right? That's the right thing to do, because so then and you could just see him gaining control over himself. And so really what was happening is in his mind, in his brain, we'll say, there was a war between the psyche, the ego, that was starting to become integrated, you know, and starting to become a continuous person, an identity. And it's fragile in 2-year-olds, and it can be disrupted all the time, and it is. That's why they're so hyper emotional. It's fragile, that little ego, and it doesn't have a lot of power. And so what you want to do is reward it when it wins. You know, it's when he gets control over the underlying motivations. You want to say, hey, good work, man, good work, kid, you did it, you know, you got yourself under control, way to be. And the kid's really happy about that, because it's actually not that much fun to have a temper tantrum. It's exhausting, you know, it takes you over. Question?
Yeah, can you give an example of what you would reward him with?
Oh, just a pat on the head, or, you know, that's good, or kind word, you know, or whatever. Or, yeah, notice it, pay attention, that's it, pay attention. And that's it's a great thing to know with people, like in your relationships. Here's the key to a good relationship. It's not the only one, but watch your person carefully, carefully, carefully. And whenever they do something that you would like them to do more of, tell them that that was really good. And mean it. And it's not manipulative, because if it's manipulative, it won't work. It's like you have to say, wow, I'm so glad you did that. And you have to be precise. Here's what you just did that I thought was great. And oh boy, that's so nice that you noticed. I can't believe that you noticed. It's like, you know, you do that 20 times and the person will be like the rat that's just pushing the lever for cocaine, you know. So, but no, I'm serious. Skinner established this. B.F. Skinner noticed this a long time ago. Reward is intensely useful in terms of modifying behavior, but the problem is that it's really hard to notice when things are going right, because you're kind of primed to notice when things are going wrong, and so you use threat and punishment more often as agents of shaping the people that you're around, because, you know, when everything's going right, it's like, what are you going to say? Everything's going right. It turns to zero. You just assume it, and that's not good. That's not good. You want to pay attention, and if your person, your children, your wife, your whoever, your mother, your sister, if you want to rectify your relationships with them, and I'm not saying to do this in a manipulative way, it won't work, but if they do something that's promoting harmony and peace and goodwill, it's like, attend to it, tell them that you noticed. It's like, it's so useful, and you have to get rid of your grudges and your resentment to do that, right? Because you're kind of mad at your sister, and then you notice she does something good. You think, there's no goddamn way I'm going to reward her for that. So you ignore her when she does something good. It's like, that's brilliant, that is. Because then you've just punished her for doing what you want. And people do that with their kids all the time, you know, because they let the kids dominate them. Then they get resentful. Then the kid will run up to them to show them something that's kind of spectacular, and they're not happy. They'll like, oh yeah, that's, you know, I'm working. You know, little kid is all sad about that, and he's just learned something. So, and it's not perhaps what you want him to learn. And so you have to keep your relationship with your children pristine, and that means that you can't hold a grudge or resent them, and that means that you have to help them learn how to behave so that you like them. And that way, if you like them, and you're kind of sensible, and maybe your partner also likes them, so, you know, you got a consensus going there, there's a reasonable possibility that other people will actually like them too, including other children, and then the world will open up to them. You know, then you'll bring them to people's houses, and the people will actually smile at them and give them a pat on the head, instead of thinking, oh my God, that brat's coming to visit again, I wonder what he'll break this time. You know, and that's just a horrible thing for your child to experience repetitively in situation after situation. All they learn is that adults have a false smile, but they're really lying all the time. God, it's like a bit of hell, and there's a lot of children who are trapped in that. It's really awful to see. I can see kids like that when I walk down the street, you know, it's like they're little doomed things, and there they are, and, you know, they're screwed in 15 different ways, and there's no way out of it. It's really awful. So I would not recommend that you do that. It's better to notice that you're a bit of a monster, or a lot of a monster, and notice that you are much happier with the people around you when they behave in accordance with reasonable social norms, and then you actually feel genuinely connected to them, and you want to work on their behalf so that everything works out. But if you think you're a good person and that you'd never do anything that was harmful to your children, then you can just forget about that, because you'll never take it seriously enough to actually learn. So, alright, so anyways, we live inside this story as far as I can tell, and you know, we kind of put the story together inside us to begin with, and that happens between 2 and 4 when you're integrating those motivations and emotions into a relatively functional unity, right? And that does happen between 2 and 4. If you don't have your kids socialized by the time they're 4, you might as well just forget it. And I know that sounds terribly pessimistic and all of that, but I know the literature on trying to rectify antisocial behavior in children, and after the age of 4 it's virtually impossible no matter what you do. And the reason for that is that kids who are still acting like 2-year-olds when they're 4, that, you know, they're twice as old, as a 2-year-old. That's a lot of difference. Like a 4-year-old's an adult as far as a 2-year-old is concerned. And so if the 4-year-old is still acting like a 2-year-old, that's really not good. And other 4-year-olds will come up and, you know, do a little play invitation like a dog, and you know, the kid, the 2-year-old, 4-year-old has no idea how to react to that, and so the more mature kid thinks, oh well, how about I play with you? And then that kid is isolated from the peers, and after 4 you're mostly socialized by your peers, and so you just fall farther and farther and farther behind. You're more and more alienated, you're more bitter and angry, and no wonder, and it's just not, you can't rectify it. So that's useful to know. It's like your job from 2 to 4 is to turn your child, help turn your child into a functional unity, and by 3 they should be functional enough as a unity within themselves so that they can concentrate on a voluntary goal for some reasonable length of time, which is also why it's useful to let them spend some time alone so that they can learn to amuse themselves, because if they can't amuse themselves they're not going to be able to play with other kids. And then by 3 they're sorted together enough so if another 3-year-old comes along they can at least play in parallel, and may also may be able to start playing a cooperative game. And so that's often a fantasy game, you know, pretend. And so what the kids will do, sometimes they mediate it verbally, but sometimes it's more acted out. It's a combination of the two. They'll assign each other roles. They'll do this with you too. It's like, let's have a tea party. Well, what does that mean? Well, it means let's sit down and act out the act of sharing food and see if we can get that right. That's what the kid's saying. We'll have a little tea party. You know, it's very important because human beings share food. Like, this is a major thing to get right, man. And so the kid will say, well, you be the mom and I'll be the dad, and you know, we'll make a little fort and that'll be our house, and we'll go in there and we'll run our roles, and you know, we're acting out family. And if we're both reasonably civilized as 3-year-olds, we can concentrate on that goal. We can establish that little fictional world. We can negotiate a mutual goal, and then we can run the simulation. And that's what kids are doing when they're pretending. It's bloody brilliant. That's play, man. It's like, it's brilliant. It's absolutely unbelievable, because, you know, if you're going to play mom, let's say, it isn't like it isn't exactly like you imitate your mom, because imitation would be, you know how annoying it is when someone copies you. So, you know, you're sitting like that, and then I do the same thing. It's like, that's really annoying. And that isn't what kids do. They don't act out the precise actions that they've seen the target of their fantasy display. They're way more sophisticated than that. They watch their mother, let's say, like hawks, and then they start to extract out regularities in their behavior, which is mum behavior, let's say. That's what makes you mum, whatever that is. And then, so it's like they look at you across time and they extract out the regularity that makes you mother, and then they try to embody that regularity in their pretend play, and then they sort of encapsulate or incorporate the spirit of being a mother or being a father or whatever, or an animal, because they'll play at that. And so that's what they're doing. They're using their body and their mind as dramatic forums. It's really amazing, you know. It's so sophisticated, and no other animal does that as far as we know. And it's the platform on which language is based, you know. First of all, we imitate, and language is imitation, right? Because we use the same words, right? So it's imitation. It's a big deal. So you can act out someone else, and then you can conceptualize them in fantasy, and it's only way after that that you could maybe articulate it. Like, what does it mean to be a mother? So I could have you write an essay about that. Well, you'd have to think about it, right? You wouldn't just automatically know. But if someone hands you a baby, and you know you're not completely socially blind, you roughly know what to do after you're done with your initial nervousness. You roughly know what to do. Don't drop it. That's a good rule. You've probably figured that one out at least. You know, don't yell at it, don't startle it, give it a little pat maybe, try hugging it. Maybe you go like this, you know, you make eyes at it. You know what to do. It's built into you, you know, it's built into you. But that doesn't mean you could lay it out as a series of rules about how to be a mother. It's like you could write a whole damn book about that. So, alright, so anyways, you live in this story. And first of all, you get your own story together. And that's by integrating your motivations and emotions together under social influence. You know, Piaget kind of states that before the age of 3, kids can't really play. They're egocentric. And it's not exactly right, because you're actually playing with your mother from the time you're born. So even with breastfeeding, that's a social interaction, and it's a complex cooperative endeavor, and it's often hard for mother and infant to get that right, because it's complicated, and it requires a lot of social interaction. Like, well, the child has to learn not to bite, for example, you know, and the mother has to learn not to be too nervous, and there's a lot of social bonding. It's really complicated social interaction. So the child, the infant, even at the earliest stages, is already engaged in a complex social dynamic that's essentially play-oriented. But it's, you know, it's pretty primordial. It has to do mostly with the mouth, and child's mouth and tongue are already hardwired at birth. So your child is this is a Freudian observation as well, your child is almost all mouth and tongue when it's born. The rest of its body, well, you watch infants, like, even when they're, how old? 7 months, 6 months, 4 months, I can't even remember now. You know, they'll move their arm and they kind of go like this. It's like they have got no fine control. It's more like they have, you know, clubs on the ends of sticks. It's like that. Their nervous system isn't thoroughly myelinated. They don't have control over themselves, but their mouth and tongue are already wired up, and so otherwise they wouldn't be able to swallow or nurse. So the oral element is extraordinarily important for a young child. That's why kids put everything in their mouth, you know, even when they're a bit older. It's like they see with their tongue, which of course everyone can do. You know, if you put a block in your mouth, you can tell that it's like a cube. You can tell that it's a cube without looking at it. So you can see with your tongue, you can see with your hands, you can even see to some degree with your ears. Anyways, so there's social interaction right from the beginning, but for the point of simplification, you might say, well, first the child organizes themselves into a functional unity under the pressure of social dynamics, and then they get unified enough so that they can attain unity with another child by setting up a fictional world and cooperating and competing within that, because that's quite interesting too, because, you know, people often juxtapose cooperation and competition as if they're opposites, but they're not opposites at all. Another Piagetian observation. So you say, well, is hockey a competitive game? And people would say, well, yeah, but then you think, well, really? Really? No one brings a basketball, right? So we're going to play by the rules. That's cooperation. Well, are the teams competing against each other? Well, yes, but they agree to compete within a particular landscape, and they all cooperate to maintain that landscape. And so you do the same thing when you're playing Monopoly. It's like you're trying to win, but at the same time you're cooperating. And that's society, man. That's society right there. You're cooperating. That's the big enclosure, and within that there are regulated competitions. But to separate those artificially and say, well, one's competition and the other's cooperation is just, it's just not very smart. It's not observant. That isn't how it works. And games are intensely cooperative, even if they're intensely competitive. I mean, the hockey teams are playing the same game. That's the cooperation. Then each team, there's competition within the team to be the best player, let's say, but everyone wants that because everyone wants good players to emerge, but you still cooperate like mad with your teammates, and if you don't pass and you know, play like a reasonable person, then they're going to not be happy with you. And so even within that competition, cooperation is regulating the interactions. And then you can think, this is a really good thing to think too. It's like, you know, people often say to their kids, it doesn't matter whether you win or lose, it's how you play the game. And the kid, of course, has no idea what that means. It's like, what do you mean? I'm trying to win. And the parent says, no, no, it matters how you play. And the kid pushes them, and the parents really can't come up with a good explanation of why that's the case. They might say, well, other kids won't play with you if you're, oh, there you go. Because you could say, this is something to think about. So there's a game, and there's a victory within the game. But then there's the set of all games. And there's victory across the set of all games. And the victory that you attain across the set of all games isn't winning all the games. It's being invited to play all the games. And so if you play fair, then you're playing a metagame. And the metagame is how to win across the set of all games. And so if you teach your child how to behave properly, then they always get invited to play. And that makes them winners. And that's that. And so if you understand that, you understand something phenomenally important about the emergence of morality. You know, because people, moral relativists in particular, think that morality is relative, you know, and of course human beings are diverse, just like languages are diverse, and there's more than one playable game, but there's not really more than one playable metagame. It's like you're either the kind of person that other people want to play with, or you're not. And if you're not the kind of person that other people want to play with, then you're a loser. It's as simple as that. And that's true of all cultures. They might be playing different individual games within their culture, undoubtedly they are, but the set of all games that they play is still common across cultures. That's part of what makes us human. And then you could say as well, we're actually evolved to detect people who are good at playing the set of all possible games. And we actually know that. That's not theoretical. We know, for example, some things are easy to remember and some things are hard to remember, you know. Here's something that's easy to remember. You play with someone and they cheat. Man, you will remember that. That's like in your mind. That's not going anywhere. And so you're great at detecting cheaters. And you remember. And that's because you can't trust a cheater. And you shouldn't invite a cheater to play a game with you because they might cheat. And so that's part of the innate morality system. You remember cheaters because they aren't good at playing the metagame. And of course you're evolved. Of course you're adapted to the metagame because you're the product of this immense evolutionary history, right? And whoever your ancestors were, which is an unbroken string of successful reproducers going back 3.5 billion years, you think about that. Every single one of your ancestors successfully reproduced. It's mind-boggling. The chances against that are so, it's billions to one, and here you are, the line of 3.5 billion years of success. The whole world was trying to kill you that whole time, and here you are. It's like, but you know, you're still only going to last about 80 years. So, but that's, you know, still, you know, good for you. So anyways, there were lots of games that your ancestors were playing across that immense span of time. Many, you know, lizard games and tree dweller games and crustacean games, you know, that huge set of games, and you're adapted to win across those games, all of them, and that's built into you, man. That's your central human nature. That's what makes you social, and it's not some mere cultural construct. Quite the contrary. It's so deeply embedded in you. It's what you are. All right, so, well, this is a story. It's a game too. That's another way of thinking about it, you know. Well, like, that's a Monopoly game. Well, what's the frame? Well, that's the rules of the game. And why do you accept them? Well, it's kind of arbitrary, right? It's like, that happens to be the rules. Hockey has different rules. Basketball has different rules. But what they share is that they have rules. Okay, so there's a frame. That's the rules. And then within the frame, there's a goal. And the goal is whatever the rules dictate. You know, it's usually the construction of a hierarchy of success within a frame. And so that's what you play. And so you play Monopoly, and it's like, well, we'll accept the rules, that's the social contract, and then we'll each try to win, and that'll be fun. We find that amusing. And if you lose, what do you say? Well, you say, well, there's always another game. And so that's great. So if you have that attitude and you play fair, then it doesn't matter that much that whether you win or lose, although you still want to try to win because otherwise you're not a good player, but you accept defeat gracefully because you can play again. And so, and you'll win some and you'll lose some, and so that's not so bad, you know. And even if you lose, well, maybe you learn something, and you're doing a lot more than one thing while you're playing Monopoly. You know, you're having a conversation and learning how to interact with people and learning how to regulate your emotions. And so even if you lose, if you have any sense, you win. And if your kids have any sense, they know that. And so that way you buffer them against defeat. It's like, yeah, you know, next time. It's like, it's okay. And you should try, but it's okay. And that's useful information for people to know. So, all right, so you're always in one of these little frameworks, and there's just no getting out of it. So, and that's because, you know, at any given moment, this is like, it's like field theory. There used to be psychological theories that talked about the field of human experience, something like that, and this is kind of what that is. This is a field, and basically what happens is you parse out a little part of the world, say, and so an amount you can handle. So let's say it has some duration. You're not aiming at something 50 years in the future. It's because how the hell are you going to do that? There's too many variables, you know. So you're aiming at some handleable amount of time, and you posit a goal in there, and you plot your route, and then that tells you what's up and tells you what's down, because up moves you towards the goal and down moves you away from the goal, and that sets up your motivational framework so that you have something worth attaining. You know, that's a really interesting thing to know too. Is like, why have a goal? Well, it's easy. No goal, no positive emotion. Because you experience positive emotion by noticing that you're moving towards a goal. And so if you don't have a goal, well, you can't have any positive emotion. So you better have a goal. And so you might say, well, what should the goal be? Well, we could start by saying, well, any goal is better than none. And then we might say, well, it should be a goal that other people will let you pursue, because otherwise it's going to be kind of difficult, and maybe they'll be even happy to help you pursue it. That would even be better. And maybe it's a goal that would enable you to learn how to pursue other goals while you pursue that goal. Boy, that would really be good. And so you can see that your goal is parameterized, but that doesn't mean that any old goal works. It means there's some goals that work nicely and some not so nicely. There are playable games and non-playable games. That's a good way of thinking about it. And you want to have a playable game, and there's a lot of them. Lawyer, plumber, you know, actor, whatever. They're playable games, and it's not obvious which one's better, but it's certainly obvious which ones are sustainable and which ones are worse. And so there's a set of playable games, and you need to extract from that set of playable games a game that suits you. And that would be partly due to your temperament, you know, because extroverted people want to play an extroverted game, and highly neurotic people want to play a safe game, and agreeable people want to play a generous game, and disagreeable people want to play a game that's highly competitive so they can win, and, you know, fine, but they're all within the realm of playable games, and that means they're socially acceptable as well. And so that means it isn't just arbitrary, it isn't just relative what you decide to do. It's heavily parameterized. There's a set of playable games, and it's large. The set is large, but there are commonalities within it, and that's why there are commonalities. That's why morality has a common basis fundamentally, and so that's partly what we're trying to investigate. Is like, what's up? What does up mean? What does it mean? Is there such a thing? Now, one thing to remember is that if you don't erect a hierarchical structure with something to aim at, you got no positive motivation, because you experience positive motivation in relationship to a goal, not from attaining the goal. That's satisfaction. And besides, it's fleeting. You know perfectly well. You graduate from university, poof, next day you have a problem, which is what do you do next? And that's a tough problem. It's not like you've solved your problems by winning that game. You just introduced the problem of having to introduce another game. So it's unreliable as a source of positive emotion, but what's reliable is you set a goal and you try to attain it, and then that gives your life, that literally provides your life with meaning. That's what meaning is. Now it's more than that, but that's what it is. And so then you might ask yourself, well, what's a really good goal? Well, that's what we're trying to figure out. What's a really good goal? And now, okay, so you got that. So now I'm going to walk through, at least partly through, we'll see how far we get, I'm going to walk through Pinocchio with you, because that's what the movie's about. And it's hard to say how it came about. Like, it was written, a story by a guy named Collodi, C-O-L-L-O-D-I. It's quite a bit different, the story, the written one, from the Disney version. The Disney version was a product of the collaboration of geniuses of animation, essentially. So they were artistic geniuses, great at capturing motion and emotion and all of that, be stellar at that, and imaginative, tremendously imaginative, but collectively imaginative. And so they put together a collective product. And you might say, well, how did they do that exactly? It's like, well, they were good storytellers. And what does that mean? Well, it means you know the story that works and the story that doesn't. And maybe partly what you do is you kind of think out a story and you think, well, what if this happens? And, well, maybe this should happen. Oh, that's the thing. Oh, that would work. It's like the little flash of inspiration, right? It's like you got a piece of the puzzle that fits. You think, yeah, that would work there. And then you talk to the other people and you generate ideas, and someone says, well, what if they do this? And everyone goes, no, 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 that's just not believable. No one's going to buy that. And someone else has a little revelation. They say, well, you know, it makes some sense somehow if they do this. And everybody goes, oh yeah, that really that really works. It's like, why? Why? Well, you don't know why it works, but it works because it's the right story. And so what does that mean? Well, it's kind of associated with this metagame idea. You know, it's like there's a story that you should be acting out that works across games, and you have an inkling of it, you have a notion of it, you have a vague apprehension of it. It's sort of built into you. That's archetype. That's an archetype. And so then when you read a story that works, you're just entranced by it. And you all know that. You go to a movie and it's a great movie and it's like you're just blown away. You know, a movie can pull you in and turn you into one of the screen characters and like run you through a huge set of emotions. I saw this movie once about South America. It started with this guy running out of a subway naked, and he didn't know where he was, and it turned out that he had been absconded by the totalitarian death squads, and he couldn't remember anything about himself. And he went back to his village, and basically what happened was that he ended up back in the totalitarian death grip. And it showed how the fascist state had saturated the village completely, and so it was a tragedy. And you could see with every action that this amnestic guy, as he recreated himself and remembered his identity, was going to travel down exactly the same road because nothing had changed. And by the time, I've looked for what that movie was for years, I've never been able to find it again, but when the movie was over, every single person in the theater was crying, and not just a little bit, it was like they were just out of it. It was brilliant, terrifying movie, and that meant there was something right about it, man, and it got people. And you might say, you know, you have dim apprehensions about the world, and some of those are instinctual and some of those are a consequence of your experience, and it's like the pieces are fragmented, but if you get away from them a long ways, you could see how they fit together, but they're fragmented. And then you go see a story and those pieces go click, 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 and you think, wow, that's how that works out. That's what that means. And that produces that overwhelming emotion. And that's partly how you make yourself transparent to yourself. You know, you go experience a story, you go watch a story, you tell a story, and you start to find out who you are by doing that. My nephew had a dream at one point. Someone made a little animated thing out of it and put it on the internet, which is quite cool. So anyways, he was having night terrors, and he ran around like a little knight, you know, a Knight, K-N-I-G-H-T, knight, and he had a little, you know, armor and a sword, and he'd run around the house with a little knight hat on, being a knight. And he was only like 4 or something, and he'd watched a lot of Disney movies, a lot of movies, so he kind of got the knight idea. He's acting that out, and he was having these terrors at night, right? And so he'd go to bed with his little knight hat and his sword, and he'd put him on his bed, and then at night he'd wake up screaming, and that happened for a very long time. And so when I went to visit, you know, I found out that this was happening, and he had a night terror. So the kid wakes up with night terrors, screaming, but can't remember anything, generally speaking. So anyways, this was happening, and so it happened one day, and I was sitting with him and his family at the breakfast table, and I said, did you have a dream? And he said, oh yes, I had a dream. I said, well, you know, what was your dream? And he said, well, I was out on this field, and I was surrounded by these dwarfs, and they came up to my knees, and they didn't have any arms, they had big feet, and they were covered with hair, and there was a cross shaved at the top of their head, and they were all greasy, and they had huge beaks. And everywhere I went, they jumped at me with their beaks. And there was lots of them. And everybody was very quiet after he said this, because it was like, that's why you're screaming at night. It's like, yeah, okay. And and then he said, but at the background there was a dragon, and the dragon would blow out smoke and fire, and then it would turn into these dwarfs. So it's like, man, that kid had a problem, right? It was like, well, what are you going to do? You fight off a dwarf, who cares? It's like, puff, 10 more. That's life, man. That's life. Really, that's the Hydra. You cut off one head, 7 more grow. That's life. Snakes everywhere. And you get rid of one, there'll be more. And so he figured that out. It's a hell of an existential shock when you're 4. And so he's like, he's a knight. He's thinking, what do I do about these dwarfs? Well, there's too many of them, but there's a dragon. Well, so I said, well, what could you do about that? Right? Loaded question. It implies that you could do something about that. Well, he kind of knew that, which is why he was running around like a knight. And he kind of figured that out. And he said, well, I get my dad, and I jump up on the dragon, and I poke out both of its eyes with my sword, and then I go right down its stomach to the place where the fire came out, the firebox, and then I'd carve a piece of the firebox out and I'd make a shield. And that would be the end of that. And I thought, wow, good work, kid. Like, you really got it, right? It's the central human story. There's the terrible unknown, right? Fire breathing, generating trouble, and what do? You confront that. You confront that, and by confronting it, you get stronger. That's the shield, and that's what a human being is, and that's right. It's exactly right. And that was the end of his night terrors, by the way, which seems too good to be true, but it is actually true, because I followed up with his mother for a long time, and that was that. He catalyzed that part of his identity. He adopted the role of the mythological hero, and that's what he needed to do, because like there was lots of there's a dragon and a bunch of dwarfs. Like, what the hell are you going to do about that? Run? That's not going to help. You know, if you run in a dream like that, the dwarves multiply and they get bigger, and you get smaller as you run. It's like, that is not a good solution, and people do that in their life all the time. And so the dwarves get bigger until they're giants, and they get smaller until there's nothing left of them, and then there's no recovery. That is not good. Now, okay, so now I also propose to you that there's a symbolic structure to the world. It's a meta structure, I would say. I think these categories are truly real, and they're basically this. There's unexplored territory, there's explored territory, and there's you. And unexplored territory is the source of great riches, and it probably will kill you, and explored territory is your culture, and it crunches you into submission and conformity and turns you into a civilized being, and you're stuck with both of those. And then there's you, and you know, you're kind of admirable and cool, and you do a lot of decent, wonderful, amazing things, and there's things about you that are just horrible, and you know about them, and you're stuck with them, and that's the world, and that's the landscape of the world. And what you'll see, if you pay attention, is that people who are ideologues, like Rousseau, or say like Hobbes, but it doesn't matter, ideologues will tell you part of that story. So environmentalists, for example, will say nature, that's pristine beauty, natural harmony, French landscape. It's a paradise, especially if there are no people. It's a paradise. And then culture is a rapacious monster, and human beings driving that culture against nature are monsters of a sort, and perhaps there should be fewer of them. It's like, yeah, that's all true, exactly, dead on, right on, exactly right. Was that movie called Avatar? Yes, that's James Cameron's movie, right? That's that story, yeah. And hey, it's a good story. It's even a mythological story, but it's only half the story. The other story, you could think about it as a frontier myth. That's Star Trek, or Star Wars for that matter, mostly Star Trek. It's like, but we'll put it in context of the frontier myth, the myth that drew settlers into America, say. It's, well, there's a wild, savage landscape out there that can be conquered by and settled and stabilized by civilization, and it'll be the heroic pioneer who does it. It's exactly the opposite story of the environmental story, which is actually why I think the environmental story eventually emerged. It was, you know, the frontier story had a lack in it, missed half of the world, and so the other story had to come up, and it did. And if you take both of those stories, even though they're exactly opposite to one another, if you know both of those stories, then you know the whole story. And it's really weird, you know, because one of the propositions of formal logic is, it's a fundamental proposition, is that something can't be itself and its opposite at the same time. It's like, that's true for some sorts of things. It's true for logical claims. But it's completely wrong in this particular situation, because things are what they are and they're opposite at the same time. And that makes it very, very difficult to, that's why a dragon hoards gold. It's like, What's up with that? Well, it'll eat you, and it will, but it has gold. Well, so what do you do about that? Because it's paradoxical demands. Well, what you want to do is face the dragon and get the damn gold. That's what you want to do. Well, you have to be a paradoxical being even to do that. So, you know, in The Hobbit, for example, when, what's his name? Frodo, right? It's not, or it's Bilbo. It's Bilbo in The Hobbit. You know, he's kind of this little underdeveloped, overprotected Shire dweller, and he's called on a great adventure to go and find the dragon, and he has to become a thief in order to manage it. Well, that's pretty weird, you know. It's like, well, it's because as a good citizen he's just not enough to conquer a dragon. He has to also become a bad citizen in some sense. He has to incorporate the part of himself that's monstrous, let's say, and develop that and hone it. And that's to say that, well, if you're harmless, you're not virtuous. You're just harmless. You're like a rabbit. A rabbit isn't virtuous. It just can't do anything except get eaten. It's not virtuous. If you're a monster and you don't act monstrously, then you're virtuous. But you also have to be a monster. Well, you see this all the time. Harry Potter's like that too. It's like he's flawed, he's hurt, he's got evil in him. He can talk to snakes, man. He breaks rules all the time. All the time. He's not obedient at all. But, you know, he has a good reason for breaking the rules. And if he couldn't break the rules, him and his little clique of rule-breaking, you know, troublemakers, if they didn't break the rules, they wouldn't attain the highest goal. So it's very peculiar, but it's a very, very common mythological notion. You know, the hero has to be a monster, but a controlled monster. Batman is like that, you know. I mean, it's everywhere. It's the story you always hear.
Is this where morals become ethics?
Meaning, you have to be more precise.
I feel like, because everyone's moral, but in order to become ethics, you have to refine the morals. And so you have to kind of go into...
Well, that's a good question, you know, because one question is, you know, you're kind of implicitly moral insofar as you're socialized. But that's sort of procedural. It's just built into you. This is different. This is also becoming conscious of it and expanding out your personality into dimensions that it wouldn't normally occupy. So this happens to people all the time. So, for example, lots of my clients, my clinical clients, are too agreeable. And they're generally women, because women are more agreeable than men, but not always, because I've had agreeable men as clients as well. And what happens is they're resentful and they don't know how to stand up for themselves, and it's because they're very compassionate by nature, and so if you're entering into a negotiation with them, they'll let you win. Well, that's not so good, because you know you need to win too, especially if you're in an organization of adults where there's a struggle, right? When you have kids, you can let them win, especially infants. You have to let them win, and that's partly why compassion is so necessary. But as a basis for negotiation between adults, it's like, sorry, it's insufficient. You have to be a bit of a monster so that you can say no. And so a lot of what you do in psychotherapy is treat people's anxiety and depression. That's a huge chunk of it. Help them straighten out the way they think. That's a huge chunk of it. But another chunk of it is, well, let's toughen you up. You know, let's put you in a position where you can bargain. Let's teach you how to assert yourself and stand up for yourself. And that's assertiveness training. And it's a huge chunk of psychotherapy. And you need to learn it. It's like, because part of how you regulate your interactions with other people is to negotiate. And you cannot negotiate unless you can say no. You can't do it. And it causes conflict to say no, and if you don't like conflict, which is basically the definition of being agreeable, then you can't tolerate the conflict, and so then you can't negotiate on your own behalf, and so then you keep losing, and you're bullied, and you know, it's not good. Then you get resentful, and it's really not good. So you have to develop your inner monster a little bit, and then that makes you a better person, not a worse person. It's weird, but that's just how it is. Outside of that diagram is chaos itself, and that's the chaos from which things emerge. Now, I can't tell you much about that yet because it's too damn complicated. But I think the best way to think about chaos is as potential. That's one way of thinking about it. It's also that place you end up when you don't know what to do. It's the source of all things, but it's also the terrible predator, the terrible eternal predator that lurks beyond the explored domain. It's a winged dragon, and it's winged who knows why. Matter and spirit, that's partly what it is, and I'll explain that later. It's also potentially the predatory beast that's been after us for forever, and the winged predator that picked us off from the sky. So primates, for example, monkeys have, some monkeys have 3 specialized alarm cries. One is for snakes, and that usually means hit the trees. And then one's for leopards, and that means hit the trees and go out on a skinny branch because the leopard can't get to you. And then there's one for like birds of prey, which means hide somewhere on the ground so that you don't get picked off. And it's like, well, that's what that is. That's what that is. And that's chaos. And it's expanded into much more than that. And then I showed you, I don't remember if I showed you this, but this is a symbolic representation of Mother Nature, Father Culture, and the suffering individual. But it's all, that's all positive. There's no negative elements there. But that's okay. That's a partial representation. And those things are sacred in some sense because they are representative of an ultimate reality. The sacrificial individual here, the suffering individual, well, that's pretty straightforward. It's like, that's life. That's suffering, that's life. That's what happens to the individual. And so, and everyone is looking at that. It has power, that idea. Well, it's because, you know, culture supports the suffering individual, and culture's nested inside benevolent nature, and that's part of the story of the world. And it's just part of the story we're trying to figure out and make articulate. We've been doing that for thousands of years, trying to make this story articulate. And it's not yet articulate. We're only getting it. And we basically do that now, mostly with movies and stories and fiction and that sort of thing. We still don't have it articulated. I think Jung came closer than anyone else. Jung and Erich Neumann, who was one of his students, came closer than anyone else ever has to actually articulating that, and that's what Jung was trying to do, is to take all these images, archetypal, very impulsive, you know, and you know, because everybody says, well, you should be happy. It's like, well, no. When you're happy, you're actually quite stupid. And so, because happiness makes you impulsive, happiness says, hey, things are really good right now, get what you can while the getting's good. And so, like if you're hyper optimistic, manic, we'll say, it's like every stock investment looks like a really good stock investment. It's like you go out and spend all your money because look, there's those wonderful things everywhere and you could do such great things with them, and then, you know, you spend all your money and then you crash and you think, oh God, my life's over, you know, because I just spent all my money on all this useless stuff, and it's all under the grip of impulsive positive emotion, you know. And so when you're telling your kids to be quiet and settle down, it isn't because they're making a lot of noise being in pain. It's because they're running around like wild baboons having a blast and disrupting things. Images, instinctual images, and say, well, what do they mean? What do they mean? What do they mean? And he got a long ways on that, although his writing is quite obscure. And it's obscure because, well, how the hell are you going to explain an image like that without being obscure? It's like, it's insanely complicated, and it's not linear. It's not a linear thing. That's why it's in a picture, because a picture presents everything at once, and you want to take that apart linearly. Jesus, it's just impossible. But we've been struggling to do that. Really, we've been struggling to do that from the time we became self-conscious. You know, what is the world about? How should we live in it? Well, that's a partial answer, and it's a culture-bound answer, obviously. But you see, archetypal representations like this in many cultures. So for example, the image of the Virgin and Child, that way predates Christianity. Like the Egyptians, that was Isis and Horus. That goes back oh, we have no idea how far, thousands and thousands of years before the emergence of Judaism and Christianity, way back before that, and no doubt back into prehistory itself, because a culture that doesn't hold the mother and child as sacred dies, obviously, because obviously, so it has to be held as something that you revere, which at least means you don't kill mothers and children. It at least means that. And that's an instinct, you know, it's an instinct. It violates you to do that, and thank God. All right, let's take 15 minutes. So, I told you about this a little bit last week, but you know, one of the motivations I had for thinking the things that I've thought through, the motivation I had for thinking them through was because, well, it seemed self-evident to me, let's say, and I think that was partly from reading Jung, that just helped me clarify it, was that, you know, it was sort of Jung's contention that we had a organic development of a metaphysical ethic that was embedded in religious tradition, and that basically unfolded, let's say, in the West till about 1600, 1500, something like that, and then science emerged and we got unbelievably technologically powerful and using a certain view of the world. You know, we're so technologically powerful, but we're still not very wise, and that just seems to me to be a bad combination. And I thought about that a lot. It's like, okay, well, how do you handle the combination of exceptional technological power and an impaired ethic, let's say, something like that, underdeveloped ethic, or one even in which you have no faith, because, you know, it seems the foundational elements of it are irrational. They're in mythology, they're in religion, they don't fit well with the scientific worldview. How do you rectify that problem? And well, that's a tough problem, you know, it's a crazy problem, and certainly it was the problem that Jung was trying to address, there's no doubt about it. And along with that went an associated problem, which was, you know, what happened in the 20th century, which was so awful, and in so many places it was just so unbelievably brutal and terrible, and it was perpetrated by millions of people, and they were individual people, and they weren't that much different from normal people. In fact, they were normal people. And so the other thing that struck me was that it would be better if that sort of thing didn't happen anymore, and so I was trying to figure out what the hell could possibly be done about that. And you know, part of Jung's contention was, well, you had to understand yourself as a monster if you were ever going to maintain some control over the fact that you are in fact a monster, and that could come forth if the situation is correct. It's like, okay, that seems reasonable. And so, well, it seemed to me that, you know, people had to become wiser, and of course that's a very difficult thing to figure out, because you can even question whether there is such a thing as wisdom, you know. And then I thought, well, that's what the universities are supposed to do, especially the humanities, mostly in particular. It's supposed to make you wise. That's what it's for, and it's doing a terrible job of that in my estimation. It's more decimating people, as far as I can tell, and undermining whatever ethic they have, rather than making people wise. But I think that we have to become wise. I don't think there's a choice. I think it's a matter of survival, and it's more than that, because if you're wise in your own life, you're going to have a way better life, like incomparably better, because you're going to sleep soundly with a good conscience at night. And you know, people say that's worth more than money, and that's worth more than money. I know lots of people who have lots of money, and let me tell you, money protects you. You're as well protected from the world by money right now as you ever will be for the rest of your life, because most of life's fundamental problems can't be solved with money. You know, like rich people get divorced, they have affairs, their children get sick, they have all the problems you have, and that's partly because you're already rich. And so you might think that if you had a bunch more money things would be better, but it's just not true. In fact, in some ways they might be worse, because money can open up the possibility of all sorts of temptations to you that you just can't afford at the moment. So, well, so like economics, we've already solved that problem fundamentally, and we're rapidly solving it everywhere in the world, right? I mean, the world economy is growing so damn fast that you can't even imagine how you could possibly make it grow any faster. It's crazy. We've lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty in the last 15 years, you know. The UN set a goal by 2015, I think it was to cut poverty by half, if I remember correctly, and they reached it 2 years early, you know. It's like, it's unbelievable. So, well, so then I started to try to understand what it might be to live, and really what I was looking for was not so much to live a life that was wise, but at least to live a life that wasn't pathologically unwise, you know. And I thought of the sorts of things that people were doing to one another in the Auschwitz camps and in the Gulag Archipelago, and all of that horror that was perpetrated on people as definitely unwise. Whatever else you might say about it was unwise. And so then I thought, well, maybe there's a way to figure out how you could not do that. And so that's, and I think that that's, my sense is that when you come to university to learn how to be a civilized person, which is what